Josephus turned out to be a brilliant general. Even though he was up until then inexperienced in war, he had a natural aptitude for cunning and strategy and intrigue. His reputation soared. He was a celebrity. His name was on everybody's lips. He was winning battle after battle after battle. And he had a lot of zealots, of course, in his forces. But finally he met his match at Jotapata, an important mountain stronghold in the hills of Galilee, only a few miles from Nazareth, where Jesus grew up. General Vespasian, the Roman general, coming down from the north out of Syria, laid siege to the city. And even though Josephus masterfully kept him off for a considerable time, after 47 days of battering, the Romans finally penetrated the city. People were killed, the city and its fortifications burned to the ground in July 67 AD. And then Josephus did something that turned him from hero to villain in a single day. 35 years after Judas betrayed Jesus to the Jewish leadership in Jerusalem, Josephus betrayed the Jewish nation to Rome. Josephus entered Jotapata as one of the brightest and best young Jews in Palestine. He left the town as its most famous traitor. He occupies a place in Jewish history equivalent to Judas Iscariot in Christian history and maybe to Benedict Arnold in American history. And here's how it happened. Vespasian had laid siege to the city. Josephus and his forces were within the city. And as Vespasian broke through the walls of Jotapata, Josephus jumped into a pit and found that it was connected to a cave. When he entered the cave through a corridor, he found there were 40 others already there, well provisioned with food, water. And so while Vespasian is sacking the city up above them, they're safe. Vespasian is looking for Josephus. Josephus is the prize of war. So he was the one who just held people's attention and caught their imagination, this famous, brilliant, charismatic Josephus. And Vespasian and his men are going through the corpses trying to find Josephus. On the third day, after Josephus had hid out in the cave, a woman of their party was captured, and she told where Josephus and his companions were. Vespasian sent emissaries, promising safe passage if they would come out. Vespasian really didn't want Josephus dead. He wanted a prize. Everyone was impressed with Josephus. Vespasian wanted to be able to exhibit him as a war trophy. Josephus was ready to strike a bargain, but the 40 soldiers were zealots, and they wouldn't hear of it. Zealots died for freedom. They didn't make deals. Making a deal with Vespasian would be a disgrace, totally dishonoring them. They insisted on suicide, a characteristic zealot stance. Josephus made an eloquent speech against suicide, but they were not convinced and came at him, brandishing their swords, ready to kill him, disgusted that he would choose life over honor, choose to buckle under to pagan Rome rather than die as a free Jew, loyal to the law of Moses. Well, Josephus was always quick with words, and so he offered a compromise. Suicide was wrong, but death in battle was honorable. So they would draw lots, and they would kill each other in turn, and the last one would kill himself. Well, that satisfied the zealots, and Josephus, by some stratagem, arranged to get the last straw. He would be the last one. So after he had killed the last person, he'd kill himself. So they went at it. The 40 men plus Josephus, they killed each other in turn, and when 39 had been killed, it was the 40th soldier's turn to offer his neck to the sword, and he and Josephus agreed that that was enough killing. They left the cave and gave themselves up to the Romans. Vespasian spared his life, but made him a prisoner. And then Josephus outdid himself. He requested a private meeting with Vespasian and Titus. Titus was Vespasian's son. And when he had them to himself, he said, "You suppose, sir, that in capturing me you've merely secured a prisoner. But I come to you as a messenger of the greatness that awaits you, sent by God himself." He slipped into the role of a holy prophet and proceeded to prophesy that Vespasian would soon be Caesar and emperor of Rome. Well, Vespasian, initially a little skeptical, gradually became convinced. The prediction began to go to his head. He kept Josephus prisoner, but treated him with special care and honor, presenting him with clothing and gifts. He wasn't sure what he had here. He was going to be careful. And it wasn't long before Josephus was an insider with Vespasian. Vespasian thought he'd captured an enemy. He ended up with a prophet who brought God into the picture, and especially a God who was on his side and would make him emperor. Within weeks, Josephus was leading the Roman troops into Jerusalem to destroy his own nation. Just weeks before, he had been general of the Jewish forces in Galilee. Now he was commanding Roman troops into Jerusalem, killing his fellow Jews, tearing down the holy city, wrecking the holy temple. Vespasian became very fond of him and adopted him, made him his son. Josephus took on a Roman name, Flavius Josephus. His birth name was Joseph ben Mattathias. And after the war, this is in the year 70 AD, after the fall of Jerusalem, after the war he went to live in Rome and became an honorary citizen of the empire and lived the rest of his life on a comfortable pension. He was the personal friend and confidant of 3 emperors running, Vespasian, Titus, and Domitian. He outlived them all, died in 100 AD. And during those Roman years, those 30 years in Rome, he wrote extraordinary books, really quite extraordinary books. Among them a rewrite of Jewish history called the Antiquities, and a history of the war in which he had played such an important part. But all through his writings, there was an underlying message. Jews needed to give up being so Jewish. The future of the world is with Rome. Don't be so stuffy, bullheaded. Get with the program. Be a real Jew. Be a Roman Jew. In short, he became a propagandist for Rome. By the way, I should just add a footnote. All this stuff about Josephus that I'm telling you came from him. It's not all flattering, but he wrote it in a way I think he intended to be flattering. And all this time, now that this was going on, the early church is in formation. All this time that Josephus is doing all these extraordinary things, and the wars are going on, the zealots are causing trouble and finally are defeated in the war. The church is being formed. This is the church of Acts. This is the church now in which the Gospels are being written, Paul's letters are being written. The Holy Spirit descended on 120 men and women on the day of Pentecost, and the Christian church was on its way. These people, These people in the early church realized that God in Jesus was alive, more alive than ever, alive in them, and they set out to follow him. Luke, an early convert and follower of Jesus, wrote the story that Josephus could have written if he'd been looking in the right place, listening to the right people. But Josephus was not in the right place. He wasn't listening to the right people. Josephus was a leader. He was on stage with the spotlights on him. He was the consummate opportunist. Following was not his cup of tea. We know that the first century in Palestine was dog-eat-dog, guerrilla warfare, random assassinations, military, paramilitary groups, conspiracies. Violence permeated that society. The only reason there was any order at all was because of the massive Roman presence. Always under the surface, there was this seething ferment of violent revolt. It's important, I think, to have a sense of this as we put ourselves in the company of the early church. They experienced some of this violence at the outset. The crucifixion of Jesus set the conditions in which the church would be formed. The newly formed church was first mocked, and then its leaders arrested and put in prison. Peter and John were brought before Caiaphas, who had so recently arranged for the crucifixion of Jesus, for questioning. Caiaphas this time was flanked by his father-in-law Annas and his sons John and Alexander, this formidable, famous high priestly family. Peter and John were supposed to be impressed and intimidated, but they weren't. So they were soon back in prison again, this time to be let out by an angel and picking up the support of Gamaliel in the process. Not long after that, Stephen was killed, the first of many Christian martyrs who preached Jesus' death and resurrection by embracing a death that they believed would be succeeded by resurrection. Paul, in his pre-Christian days, was in the front ranks, a leader in the violence on the rampage against Christians, throwing them in prison right and left. Then the name Herod surfaces again, but this time it's Herod's grandson, Herod Agrippa I, who turns out to be as murderous as his long-dead grandpa. He killed James, the Zebedee brother of John, and seeing that it made a hit with the Jews, went after Peter and put him in prison, but an angel got Peter out the same night. The revolutionary violence continued, violence against the Romans, violence against the Sadducees, and violence against the Christians, and the Romans responding with their violence, a culture of violence. And here's the remarkable thing. The Christian movement did not participate in the violence. There is not a single instance of violence reported in the Christian movement. The closest thing was in Gethsemane on the night of Jesus' arrest, when Peter pulled his sword and cut off the ear of the high priest's slave Malchus. But Jesus told him to quit it and then healed the man's ear, and that was the end of that. The reason this is so remarkable is that most of the revolutionary violence going on in Palestine in those years was fueled by religion, a concern for the freedom of God's people, a zealous resistance to the corrupting pagan presence of Rome, a furious and adamant no to the contaminating secularism of Hellenism. The Jews served a jealous God, and they were jealous on his behalf. They were part of a long tradition of holy war. Abraham freeing Lot, Moses leading his people, Joshua, David, the Maccabees. A lot of violence in the background of these people. This was religious fighting. They were fighting for God, against the Romans and the false gods and the loose morals invading their country and upholding the purity of their law and the sanctity of the Sabbath and the freedom to worship. But these first followers of Jesus didn't kill, didn't use violence, even though in the religious atmosphere of the day it was the most natural thing in the world to do. Why didn't they do it? The simple answer is that they were following the resurrected Jesus. And the Jesus who was now living in them through the Holy Spirit wasn't killing anyone.